Hello. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I hope people out there in cyberspace can see and hear clearly. My name is Simon Perrell from the Creative Writing team from Leicester Centre for Creative Writing. And I want to welcome you to this lunchtime event, our National Writing Day event. I want to welcome you on behalf of Montfort University, on behalf of our doctoral college, and as I say, on behalf of Leicester Centre for Creative Writing, that I'll say something a little bit more about in a few minutes. If you've not partaken in this kind of an event before, it's really helpful if you would turn your microphone to mute and turn off your video camera, because all of that will help us with the bandwidth. And apologies in advance if anything becomes glitchy. We've got a few backup tactics if things get a little bit hairy. Some of us will be using slides, so it might take a little while for those to upload. So do bear with us. There is a chat function on the right-hand side of your screen, which allows you to post comments, and most particularly at the end of the readings and talks to ask questions. And our colleague Sandra behind the scenes will be looking at those comments and putting them into our private chat so that we can respond to some of your questions in some kind of a discussion format at the end of the talks and readings. So just to give you a sense of the format that we're dealing with here, we've got 5 speakers, 5 writers, and 2 members of staff. Well, actually, no, me as well. I'm on, aren't I? 3 members of staff and 2 PhD students. Though it's wrong to think of them just as PhD students, because obviously they're writers and lecturers also. So the idea is that I'll say a few words about the Writing Centre, just a brief context about creative writing as practice research. Then we'll have talk readings from Rod and Siobhan, and then I will step back in after those 2 and introduce Ziandric Oliver, Z Oliver, and Sabrina Smith from our PhD cohort. And then after they've done their talks, I will actually close by saying a little bit about my research practice as a poet and read also for my given 10 minutes. I think it's fair to say we're all supposed to be talking and reading for about 10 minutes, and for there to be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So I hope that that has got through. uh, and that you can hear me. I'm not getting uh, messages saying otherwise as yet. So, okay, welcome, welcome, welcome. It sounds if from the chat that I can be heard. So, okay, so give me a second. What I'm going to do is upload the slides that I plan to just briefly talk over before we introduce Rod and Siobhan. Okay, so bear with me. Not done this before. Okay. Okay, so I imagine that what you're experiencing now is some kind of a whirly donutty thing. But eventually you'll get a slide which should say Leicester Centre for Creative Writing on it, and a collage image on the right hand side of the screen. As well as being a poet, I'm a visual artist who makes kind of collage, so that's one of mine you've got there. So because I've got the share screen open, I can't tell whether you're actually seeing this yet, so I'll just give it a minute here to let it all load, and just say something, I guess, briefly, because you don't need to see the slides to know this. So Leicester Centre for Creative Writing consists of the academic writers within the creative writing team, and I'm very happy to say that we're in the strongest position we've ever been in. Actually, we've just had 2 new members of staff join us, which means that we now have 8 permanent writers in the creative writing team at Montfort. And we're actually really excited by the prospects, the digital prospects, for the future. And really, this lunchtime event, is a trial for us, because we plan quite an extensive set of events, online events, for next academic year. So do continue to make contact. Leave your contact details, in fact, for Sandra to pick up in the chat stream, so that we can inform you of future events. So Leicester Centre for Creative Writing consists of us writing staff and our PhD students, and we've got 3 aims really within the centre. We want to promote creative writing as a taught discipline. So what does it actually mean to teach writing? We want to promote the creative work of its members, and there'll be kind of many readings and book launches to come this academic year, with all 8 of us very active, writing and publishing and performing. And particularly to promote public engagement. We're very keen to get writing out into the communities and beyond. And our flagship event, States of Independence, that takes place each March, is an independent publishing fair. So you'll hear more from us about that in the future. We'll send out messages. And as I say, we've got plans for other events, public engagement events, to come this academic year. Okay, well, I guess change now over to Can. I don't seem to be able to move the slide. Ready? Okay. Well, don't worry. I don't need the slide, the next slide necessarily. I can talk over it. What I wanted to say was that the context for this series of readings and talks is the question of, well, what makes creative writing a research discipline? And what I would want to suggest is that there's a thread for all of the speakers today. Us writers who are not PhD students, and us writers who are PhD students. And that thread is really what it means to use writing and creative practice as a way of knowing the world, engaging with the world, but knowing that world differently. What does it mean to write novels and write poems, write scripts that actually are a way of thinking about the world we inhabit. So that's a brief introduction to practice research. What I'm going to do now is turn my slides off and come back to you before introducing our first speaker. Okay, so hopefully you can see and hear me. So as I say, the first section is that two members of staff reading, Rod Duncan first, and then Siobhan Logan second. Rod is a novelist, a very distinguished and well-published novelist, and he will say something about the extended work that he's been doing on his Fall of the Gaslit Empire series. And Siobhan Logan is a poet and publisher, and she will be taking us into deep space. So I guess the subtext for all of this events really is a sense of just how vital reading has become really during lockdown circumstances, and that reading has always been a way of transporting us elsewhere and allowing us to experience other situations, other worlds, other circumstances. So what I'll do now is I'll hand over to Rod Duncan, who will say a little bit about his own work.
Thanks, Simon. Thank you. Yeah, well, when I started writing novels, which is really quite a few years ago, I imagined that what I was doing was trying to do exactly that, write a novel and get it published. And then once I had got a few novels published, I kind of changed my focus a little bit. And I thought, well, what I'm actually trying to do, what the truth of this is, that I am trying to become a better writer, trying to hone my craft. But actually that's changed again as I've gone along, and it comes back to what Simon was just saying, this sense that actually, as someone trying to develop a creative writing practice, that I don't perceive there as being any difference between that and an artistic practice more widely. And again, I don't really see any difference between that and a research practice, which fits very well actually into an academic setting. And this is something I know there are quite a lot of writers who are watching this, that you will know from your experience how the process of having a creative writing practice enriches your life, how it changes the way you perceive the world, how you train yourself to notice things that you probably wouldn't have noticed before, and that increasingly so as time goes on, and how you also train yourself to notice the kind of questions that are going to be interesting to follow. And it's those questions and the emergent discoveries of the writing process that really, I think, validate, for me anyway, this as a research practice as well as an artistic practice. Now, one of the things that I became interested in some years ago, and I'm still interested in, is crows. You will see in the photograph behind me a crow that I photographed a couple of days ago, in fact, sitting watching me there. Now, Simon kindly mentioned my Gaslit Empire novels, this kind of thing. Actually, I'm not going to be reading from those. I thought instead I would read you something from this current work in progress, which is what is consuming me with curiosity and interest and discoveries right now. And so this is a novel about crows. In the process of researching it, I've been feeding them, I've been walking in the woods, and now they follow me through the woods, tree to tree, because they know I feed them, and as this one in the picture is doing. And I've tried to be observing them as individuals, not as a species, trying to look at the difference in their characters from one to another, and it's marvelously enriched my life. And a question came to me, which was, in the witch trials, from the records of the witch trials, we know that one of the things that was taken as a sign of witchcraft was if someone had a familiar animal. And maybe that was a hedgehog, or maybe it was a mouse, or maybe it was a cat, or maybe it was a crow. And so the question that came to me, which seeded this story, which opened up this whole area of research, is what happens if a crow from that era is reincarnated in the present day and recognizes someone who it thinks was the witch with whom it had that intimate relationship years ago. And so I'm just going to read you, and you're the very first people to hear this, because it is work in progress, a little bit from that novel. And it's a point where we see through the crow's eyes, looking down at our protagonist, Ellie, who is sitting on an area of flat roof with her friend Harlin, and they are trying to make contact with this crow. And we pick the story up just as Harlin has left. The time of waiting had been long. Even in the egg, Crow had been waiting, and before that, in other lives, in other places, he had felt the shadow of a missing thing. The smells and colours and sounds of the world had changed. Once he'd seen flights of huge, stiff-winged birds lit from below by burning houses, and beams of light sweeping across the sky. In another life, he'd followed ploughshares pulled by teams of oxen, heaping the land into wide ridges. And in every life, he'd searched, though he'd not known what he was searching for. There had been a time before the waiting. The sense of it had been growing in his mind as he sat on the chimney pot looking down at the two women on the flat roof. He remembered a great gathering of humans and logs mounted on wheels that roared smoke and fire, sending out thumping waves of air, blocks of men with long sticks pressed against each other. He remembered the sound of it and the smell of blood. But flying overhead, watching the dying and the dead, Crow had been not alone. That was the memory that gripped him now, not the feast of horse flesh after the killing was over, not the taste of human fat. It was the not aloneness, the sharing of thought and senses, so that even as he was flying over the fight, he was also sitting in a wagon somewhere near, knowing that word wagon, knowing that the logs on wheels were called cannons, that the long sticks were pikes, and that the men had named the hill below his wings Naseby Ridge. The words were sounds he couldn't make with his own throat, but he could make with hers. Naseby Ridge. And there she sat, in the now of this life, leaning on the slope of slates, all the longing of many lives crowded in on him. He needed only glide across and close the space between them for the time of waiting to end. And yet forces pushed him the other way. Last time he'd closed that distance, she'd loosed a bolt towards him. Crossbow. That was another word from her mind in the time before. This time her hands were empty, but there was another human crouching next to her. The longing and the caution held each other in balance. Crow stood fixed, watching, impatient, yet caught as surely as in a trapper's net. And he had felt that too in the time before, the ending of things, and then the shell of the egg growing tight around him again, and another hatching. The sun went behind a cloud. His feathers began to cool. The other human got up and walked away. The balance of yearning and fear tilted, and with that change his own body tipped forwards. Opening his wings, he let the strength of air carry him. Feathers spread, a slow glide over the square of grass, over the ridge of the roof, low to the flat of flagstones beyond, scooping wings to stop and drop. Her eyes were on him, full round, the mother from before all his mothers, from before the darkness inside the first egg. He had known her. He stepped forwards, but ready to fly. Halfway he stopped to turn his head and observe again, she sitting, her limbs still as dead things, her eyes brimming with life and meaning, her chest rising and falling fast. Then she opened her mouth and called in words of human song, which with her mind he understood. Who are you? Opening his beak, he cawed 3 long words, throwing his body into each cry. I am Crow, I am Crow, I am Crow. She moved then, Leaning forwards, reaching out one arm, her hand open and empty, he inspected the fingers, then walked forwards again, 3 half hops and a flap of wings to the outstretched arm. He could feel the tremble in it as she lifted him. His eyes level with hers, her eyes level with his, the scratch of claws on skin, the black beads of his gaze, the recognition. Her arm outstretched now, she felt the weight of him, saw the perfect curve and shine of his beak, felt the shaking of herself as if it was an earthquake under his feet. Taking a breath from her belly, she willed her shoulder to relax, and it did relax. Her arm began to steady, all else disappeared. It lowered its head, shuddered the feathers of its wings, cawed more softly this time. Her only sensation was the crow, its weight, its eyes, its balance, the turn of its head to a new sound. She heard the scrape of footsteps through the crow's ears, not her own, saw a human creature approaching. She knew the name, Harlan, but couldn't fit it to what was in front of her. She knew the word friend, but couldn't bring it all together quickly enough. The crow tipped forwards, opening its wings for takeoff. Ali felt the waft of air against her face, the sudden lightness of her arm, but for a moment she felt also the thrill of flight, the air under her wings, the ridge tiles passing below. One more flap and the connection snapped. For a flicker she was in the nowhere between, then her body returned like a punch to the middle of the chest, like the recoil of a crossbow. Thank you. Simon, I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Rod. That was fabulous, and what a privilege to hear work that nobody heard aired before. So thanks for that. And actually, you've set an animal theme that I will return to in my section. So thanks very much, Rod Duncan. So next up we have Siobhan Logan, poet, publisher, and Siobhan is going to take us to space.
Thank you very much, Simon. Yes, so this is my book, Desert Moonfire, The Men Who Raced to Space. And it's a collection of both non-fiction and poetry, which traces the story of 2 men who were absolutely key to the space race. This is the Russian Sergei Korolev and the German scientist Wernher von Braun. And these 2 men would eventually be behind developing the spacecraft such as Sputnik, Yuri Gagarin's vessel, and Wernher von Braun built the Saturn V rocket, which took the Apollo astronauts to space. But my story takes us right from the turn of the century forward and looks at how did we get even the idea of getting into space, and takes us right up until that moment when humanity became a spacefaring species. So we're going to go right back in time, first of all, to when these 2 men are boys whose imagination is caught by stories of space, science fiction, and so on. And we start with Sergei Korolev. You can see a picture of him here, looking rather serious young boy with his toy rifle. And Sergei, his parents split up when he was about 3 years old. His mother told him that his father was dead, which saved any kind of questions about the divorce. And he spent a rather lonely childhood growing up with his grandparents while his mother was away at college. But every weekend she would come home and she would tell him this nursery story about flying on a magic carpet into space. So this is Ignition 1, Nezhin, Ukraine, 1910. Whenever she comes home, he begs for this story, hugged in close, until he's muffled by her white ruffles, a small fist hooked on her pendant. The rocking chair's keel tipping him into orbit, eyes flicking from enamelled bedstead to wicker pram, a potted fern, frost lace on the pane. And brave Serezha never cried, whizzing through space on a magic carpet from Kazakhstan, waving every night to his mamushka from the moon. in her weightless embrace, his star fingers fling wide to touch the black window. A white world outside, riding the wheeling skies. Now, in the other picture, we can see Werner von Braun, and he's about 12 years old here. He is the boy in the middle with the big beaming smile, and he's there with his two brothers, so plenty of playmates. And this finds him in 1924. He's about 12 years old, and he invents his first rocket, which is to say, he attaches a firework to his go-kart, and this is in a busy street in Berlin. Ignition 2, Tiergartenstrasse, Berlin, 1924. That Aryan boy, tearing up the neighbourhood with a rackety box cart, 6 skyrockets strapped behind, how he whoops at the fiery trail it scorches, a screeching comet tail, chortles at its giddy zigzag game of tag, cartoon thunderclap as it topples a housefrau at the fruit stall. Our young baron merely flashes his matinee smile at the Keystone Cops, while cross papa pays the fine. But it's elegant Frau von Braun, with her confirmation gift of a miniature telescope, who steers those blue eyes towards the restless stars. So 2 boys who are now already dreaming of space, and they come of age in the 1920s and 30s, and both Werner von Braun and Sergei Korolev, as teenagers, get involved in amateur space clubs, which are involved in building rockets, experimenting with rockets, trying to see how rocket technology could perhaps be used in future space travel. So we find Sergei Korolev here in 1938, and by this time, both of these young men had actually been taken up by the military and are applying their rocket technology to building weapons. Sergei here, the lonely boy, has now got his own family. We see him here with his daughter, Natasha, and he's married his college sweetheart, Ksenia, and he's got his dream job. He's building rockets for a research institute in Russia. But in 1938, all of that is about to come crashing down because we're in the middle of the Stalinist purges, and several of his colleagues have already disappeared into police cells. So this is Moscow, 27th of June, 1938, Tango. In the quiet time after work, smoke caressing the air, he's listening to Natasha snuffling in her crib. A staccato of stiletto heels brings Ksenia home, panicked by plainclothes men downstairs. Sergei stubs out his cigarette, sets the needle's expectant crackle. Shh, I know. He holds her still. While an accordion stalks the room, he waits, a man marked by the musk of her fear. When they've searched every drawer, stolen his favourite cufflinks, she packs his toothbrush and underwear. To the record's percussion of silent revolutions, he snatches a final bruising clinch. So we move across now to see what Werner von Braun is up to in Germany. And it's a very different story here because Werner has had a meteoric rise. He was scooped up by the German army to develop rocket technology for them. They fast-tracked his PhD. And then at the age of 24, he found himself installed as technical director of a huge research and development program at a secret base in Peenemünde at the Baltic coast. And by now he's working for the Nazi government and preparing for the war. And he goes on to develop the V2 rocket at Peenemünde, a rocket which is later named the Vengeance rocket by Goebbels, and is initially built by prisoner of war labour, but eventually there would be a huge V2 rocket factory with its own concentration camp. But this is slightly earlier, in 1937, when it's all taking off. Wild duck hunt. water drenched in green shadows, rippling skies of ancient oak and firs, men dipping oars, poling through rushes, their guns cocked, a dog on the prow. Perfect for you and your friends, Von Braun's mother says. Peenemünde with its forest walls and natural hide, empty seas to swallow fallen fires. So he plays in ancestral hunting grounds, sails or swims after work, at weekends slips away in his personal Luftwaffe plane for assignations with an unsuitable girl. From a vast building site, Rocket City emerges like a futuristic movie set. Its power station, a red bricked basilica, chimneys stark as Third Reich obelisks. While test rockets arc into booming surf, scatter coots and grebes out of their nests, Polish slaves from the barracks start their shift. Untermensch cogs in a metropolis machine. A technician films another explosive launch, the doctor chatting to his SS guests. Sound waves panic deer in the pine groves, but Werner grins, flicks away a cigarette. So just rounding off now with a very short poem, we're jumping forward in time now to what happened after the war. And the two men find themselves again working for the military. Werner von Braun is working for the Americans now. And Sergei Korolev again is heading up a rocket research program for the Soviet government. And then in 1957, he gets the opportunity to do something extraordinary. He launches the Sputnik satellite, which absolutely electrifies the world and really quite accidentally sparks the space race that is to follow. So in homage to the engineering of Sputnik, I wrote this little poem, which is a shape poem, which has its own engineered structure, and it celebrates Sputnik. Little moon, mirror ball comet, coat hanger whiskered, titanium plated companion, or silver bullet of paranoia. Are you beep, beep, beeping your music of the spheres for a world of radio hams, blue orbed listeners, or the KGB? So that rounds off my reading, and you can find out more about my book from Space Cat Press website, and you can get the book direct from there as well. Okay, so that's me done. I'm going to hand back to Simon now.
Thanks ever so much, Siobhan. Great to take a trip into space in one's lunchtime. Okay, so moving on. Next, we have our two PhD students. First up is Zeandric Oliver, who is a poet fundamentally, and is doing a PhD project, which is a memoir, experimental memoir that incorporates poetry and prose and explores his South African roots. So another trip out, guys, another trip out. Thank you,
Let's hope so. Thanks, Simon. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Yeah, I'm just going to give you a bit of a very brief overview of what my PhD is about. But as Simon was alluded to, I'm definitely thinking about my South African heritage. And you can probably tell from my accent that is the case. But I moved to the UK when I was pretty young. So that connection is quite difficult to kind of grasp sometimes, because a lot of my experiences is here in the UK, and I've been kind of molded by those experiences in the UK. So I'm kind of thinking through those issues. I'm going to try and share the PowerPoint quickly. Okay, so the project is called, there's a bit of a pun on my nickname, which most people call me Z, is from A to Z. That will sort of become clear. But the main focus of the project really is that it's a practice-based project. It's a memoir, if you like. It's not in chronological order, which is it's not in chronological order, which is what most memoirs tend to be written as. I wanted to try and find a different shape for this project. I didn't expect that I would be writing both prose and poetry when this project started. But the project, as writing often does, it just takes you in a place where it needs to go. And at the moment, to try and hold together this project, it's now in a bit of a sequence following the alphabet. So you have me responding to, or the language or the writing responding to a specific word in Afrikaans, and it's sort of working its way through the alphabet. So as you would expect from someone who comes from abroad, I'm interested in themes of migration, thinking about ideas about home. Home is a complex, tricky topic sometimes for me. Is home where I was born? Is home where I now live? What does that mean in terms of identity? Who am I? Those things can be quite a little bit tricky sometimes. Similarly, those kind of ideas feed into ideas about identity, that I sense of being a bit of an exile. Am I exiled from my old home, or have I been exiled, from my language to some degree? I don't really get the opportunity to speak Afrikaans very often, so my engagement with it is becoming quite tricky sometimes, and I'm trying to sometimes find my grammar gets a bit of an English overlay on it, which can be a bit weird sometimes, especially when you speak to family. As a gay man, I definitely wanted to engage with a sense of my queer identity, and then that identity feed into a higher way, then shape the work as well, a bit of a queering of form, if you like. And definitely that sense of memory as well. A memoir pulls on memory. How do we engage with memories? How do we actually find shape for memory? So I'm going to read you some short poems quickly. I was very concerned that the bandwidth is going to cut out. So I actually put the poems on screen just in case something happened. And I'm going to read you 3 very short poems, if I may. And they sort of go, the first 2 is in South Africa, and thinking about childhood, and the latter one is when I sort of transitioned into the UK. So this very first one is when I'm pretty young. I learned to, I took to an electric organ that my grandmother had in her house and started playing it. Much, I think, to the annoyance probably of my poor grandparents, who had to listen to some, well, you can't really call it music when you first start playing. When I first started to figure out how to use this instrument, and this poem kind of engages with that idea. Intermezzo. Flames quiver, tiny shadows, climb walls to diminished organ scales. My toes barely touched wood pedals. You used to listen, Opa, to the dissonance, my fingers stretching minor chords, and turn pages of bound scores. But the wicks barely lit. I cannot see where to place my hands. I think I'll just stop sharing these and I'll read the other 2 to you. So the next one is called grond, which is ground in Afrikaans, means soil. And this is a poem in that first experience when you know that you're leaving a place and you kind of realize, even though you're quite young, you may not see the space again or the people that's standing at the airport. Grond. Last night, sleep stayed distant again, seeing her at the airport, with a snotty hanky behind the terminal glass. From the plane window, as we took off, dust devils in our wake. I saw near the vines the year the drought left, 3 days of water, and filled the bath to hold one more day. And I'll just close with this last poem because I wanted to kind of think about that transition over to the UK. By this point, I'd come out and I was beginning to kind of think about what it means to find this new identity in this new country. And since Rod brought up an animal theme, I kind of quite by accident is returning to an animal theme. So this is kind of thinking about a newt, which is an animal I find quite interesting because they can change their identity as they kind of transition through their lifetime. And this is called The Day I Tried to Find the Newt. I breathed with feathered gills amid rotten water lilies, under an ice layer, the night moist, to look for a crack, starpened on the pond roof. I lacked the limbs to reach dark sky, fed on mozzies and spawn to evolve skin and scale. I pushed through slush as newborn dragonflies spread dawn wings, and my limbs touch virgin soil, footprints on a moon. Okay, that's me done, folks. I hope you enjoyed that. Pass back to you, Simon.
Thanks, Ed. That's really great. Thanks ever so much. Thanks for taking us to South Africa and for giving us more of our animal thread that seems to be emerging here. Okay, so next up we have Sabrina, one of our PhD students, and I should say that we need a content warning for Sabrina's project. Sabrina is predominantly a playwright in terms of her writing practice, but her PhD is a novel. And it is set in and explores the 90s music scene. And so there is some bad language, folk. So if there are kiddywinks out in the audience, please cover their ears. Okay, over to you, Sabrina.
Hi, everybody. My name's Sabrina Smith. I'm a PhD student here at Montfort University. I'm also a lecturer, as Simon said. Predominantly, I've done some work writing plays and writing poetry as well, but I saved the prose for my PhD project. So the project is a novel called Zazen, and it's not a novel in your general, usual linear sense. So I kind of stumbled across the idea of doing a novel a bit like a collage. So a bit like Simon and his pictures, I kind of do that, but with words. And I kind of thought, okay, if I'm going to do it like a collage, then why don't I do it about something I'm really passionate about? And something I'm quite passionate about are fanzines and the 90s music culture, so to speak. So I'm going to go all the way back to the 90s and a little bit old school with you. No slides, I'm afraid. But I've actually got some fanzines here, you know, to give you a bit of an idea of these homemade little pamphlets that used to be around in the 90s. In contrast to that, you had mainstream music press as well, like Melody Maker and NME, also around in the 90s, have died a bit of a death these days. And I thought, play around with form. Why not? Why don't I make up my own mainstream alternative music paper and tell the story through the pages from this paper? So that's what I did. Here we go. So I've started making front covers of fake Subculture magazine. It is fake. And from that, I've ended up also writing fake reviews, fake letters, fake back pages, fake questionnaires and fake interviews with all sorts of fake members of the 90s pre-Britpop music scene. And what I'm trying to do is put together a narrative that the reader can follow through all of these fake bits of journalism. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read you out a section of demo reviews, fake demo reviews about fake bands written by a fake journalist that appears in my fake magazine. Do be warned, there is swearing from the offset, drug reference, you name it, this project has got it. So I do apologise straight away for you. Cunt Rock by Cunt Rock. Will this not go away and die? If it sounds, looks and feels like a yeast infection, then it has to be a yeast infection. This submission into Subcultures postbag 17 times this year, Ed, is like a reoccurring bout of thrush. Needless to say, it sounded terrible in January and it still sounds terrible now. Remastered with what? A spatula? Nothing could disguise cunt rock's lack of cunt and distinct lack of rock. 3 male DJs from south of the river should never name themselves this and should never ever make music. They should also never ever ever send their demo into us again. I'm filing a restraining order. Yuck. Available at Camden Distro, B-Side, Softback and January Jives. Sister by the Hazy Few. Oh, lordy, by the slow dark water, our sweet soul sister could shine. Oh dear. Indie prog at its finest, by which I mean, can it get any worse? It sounds like the Happy Mondays and Caravan's ecstasy-fueled love child. I assume they all look like Phil Collins and Shaun Ryder as the cover lacks any visual treats. Enough. Thank you. Available at Camden Distro, B-Side, Softback and January Jives. Suicide Daisy by the Moonbeams. Right now, as I sit in my penthouse snorting unadulterated cocaine off the navel of my Filipino houseboy, it speaks little to me. But I'm sure that by next summer, when I'm space hopping around a Glastonbury field, half comatose on scrumpy and other relaxants, this music from Bristol will make perfect sense. Available at Disc Jockeys Bristol, Mega Oust Bristol. Demo of the week. Possessed by Lace by Perfumed. The trick to being unoriginal is to do it so darn well that nobody ever notices it wasn't your idea in the first place. This band is so close to Suede, they should rename themselves Fake Fade Bisexuals and be done with it. Looking up from the gutter with their boy divas high notes, but fatally stalled by crap guitars. Available at Camden Distro, B-Side, Softback, Out There Records, Maybe Tech, and January Jives. Perfume play B-Side Hackney on 14th January. Nowhere by the Animal Shelf. A deranged guitar winds over chatting about nocturnal admissions behind the radiator. Where are all the normal demos this week? This is 7 minutes of my life I'm not getting back. Available at Camden Distro, B-Side, Softback and Maybe Tech. Underground by Luke Smart. Luke Smart takes a lot of acid. The artwork on this cassette is draped in so much psychedelic candy that it must be part Lost Stars and Tribesmen, part Bez from the Happy Mondays. Like a real LSD trip, I expected so much and got so little. Unlistenable. Next, please. Available at January Drives, B-Side, and Maybe Tech. Wank Music by Wank Music. On behalf of all women, let me just say this again, in case any of you fellas at the back didn't quite hear me. There is nothing sexy about playing other people's records. This new incantation of a well-known DJ trio must be inspired by Jive Bunny's school disco pant-wetting mega pop mix. Wank Music's fusion of Duracell techno beats and substandard house music is an abomination. Please, ladies, do not shag them. Available at Camden Distro, January Jives, and Maybe Tech. Gold by Psychic Gift featuring Krakow. Krakow is a legendary graffiti artist and rapper from Coventry who once, not so long ago, dissed any sellout by whitewashing his tag over theirs. Now, guess what? He's joined forces with the beefy pair Psychic Gift to produce an ambitious anthem that reeks of selling out so hard and fast it might reach corporate attentions. Available at B-Side, Funky Funky and 90s Grooves. Dead to Me by Francis Clark. This is so insipid it hurts. A piano-led ballad about a broken heart aimed at all the lonely hearts at Christmas. Plink, plink, plonk, plonk, you're dead to me, squeals Francis Clark. Yes, dear, I'm sure he is. That's why you're still singing about it for a full 6 minutes. There's always a hope that when you open the demo bag, there'll be something interesting, but no, this is predictable. Available at Camden Distro, Folk Fortunes and Teddy. Demo of the week. Stop by Tube Stop. Angry, angry, angry suburbanites Tube Stop reek of righteous rage. It's the system's fault. It's the government's fault. Smash the bill are all worthy causes, but this does little to distinguish itself from Tube Stop's past 2 demos. It will sound incendentary when played loud in student discos across London, and it's a safe effort. Even so, it's the only demo that fades in this week, for which it earns a bonus point. Available at B-Side, Teddy, Camden Distro, and 90s Grooves. Tube Stop play B-Side Hackney on January the 5th. Arsehole by Arsehole. This is a joke that grows old. Arsehole needs to grow a new arsehole so they can stick their cerebrous head right up and eat their way out. Somehow this is worse than the other 2 demos. Its mix of indie landfill and beat music reminds me of Chitty Chitty Bang Bang on speed. I look forward to hearing what they come up with next. Available at Camden Distro, B-Side, Softbeck and January Drives. Demo of the week. Zazen by Sequence. Stinging like chili-impregnated Andrex, Sequence are the hottest thing in the world. What a tune for the dispossessed souls of this city. The guitars are haunting, the bass near perfect, and real drums donate a seismic backdrop to a song of such illustrious beauty. Lyrically, there's a lot to be said about what Zazen could mean to our generation. This timeless classic should catapult Sequence right from the back pages of Subculture onto front page NME. Wait, what, Ed? Available at Camden Distro, January Drives, Out There Records, B-Side and Maybe Tech. Sequence play the Good Mixer, Camden on February the 14th. Right, so what I've been trying to do really is cobble together a bit of a story about some of these bands and see kind of where it goes within the context of Zazen. Thank you very much for listening. Simon, back over to you.
So revisit, thanks for that. Okay, I am going to close the readings section by reading something from a book that's about to come out in September. So like Rod, this is work that's not actually been aired before, so I'm kind of quite excited about that. What I'm going to try and do is put a slide image, so just bear with me while I try and remember how you do that. Let's have a look. Try and keep talking while I do this. Nope, not successfully done it yet. Just give me a second. What I'm trying to do is to get up a series of book covers for you, which should work. So just bear with me one more time, otherwise I'll give up. Just one more time. Sorry, having a few technical difficulties. Actually, no. I'll tell you what. I'll leave it, and I'll try and get the slides up later if I need to. Okay. So let me just say a little bit by way of context here. The book that's coming out in September is called The Slip, and it is the final volume of a trilogy of books of poetry that explore the work and the legends that surround the ancient poet Archilochus. Archilochus, history tells us, was the first lyric poet. The first lyric poet, that's to say, a poet who used his own life and his own experiences as the stimulus for his poetry, rather than epic poetry, which was much more kind of connected to heroic figures from the past. And Archilochus was also a soldier, a mercenary, and there's a legend that surrounds him. The legend is that he was an iambic poet, which means he was not so much deployed iambic meters, but more that iambic in the ancient world was. And legend has it that Archilochus was due to marry a woman called Nebulae, and that for reasons that history doesn't record, Lycambes, Nebulae's father, called off the wedding. And as a result of that, Archilochus wrote poems so scurrilous about Lycambes and the whole family that the entire family committed suicide through shame. So it's a very, very dark legend. It touches upon lots of interesting ideas about what poetry meant in the ancient world, and particularly its capacity to cause harm through the power of language. This final volume, The Slip, is spoken by Lycambes, so it's spoken by the father, and he is undergoing the curse that the words of Archilochus have thrust upon him. He has witnessed the end of his daughters and is in the process of devising his own end. The animal connection, given that we've had fun assembling this, haven't we, this thread, the animal connection is that the Archilochus fragments, and the work only survives in fragments, involve quite a lot of references to what we call Ainos, which are kind of ancient beast fables. The most accessible version, I guess, would be Aesop and Aesop's fables. And so there's one famous fragment in Archilochus where it involves a fox and an eagle, and a fox outwitting an eagle. So the fox is a major feature in ancient lore because it was an embodiment of cunning. And I'm also interested in the octopus because it's this polymorphic creature that has many limbs, like all writing practices do, and it has this capacity to blend into other environs and become other things. So that's enough of a preamble. The book consists of 80 lyric untitled poems, and I'm just going to read a few minutes selection. So the gaps will constitute a new poem. Okay, so here we go. Poems from The Slip, spoken by Lycambes. Hail the potter who lays liquid trays under midday glare that they may adopt weight, who finds there the rudiments of shape woven from water and silt cake. May we similarly hear with our hands the sound of the shape held in clay as we wedge at the edges of form and throw it into the felting dark. I should say that Lycambes was also part of the earliest colonial missions with Archilochus's father, and a lot of these poems are about him reminiscing upon the what that might have initiated. Archilochus also took part in the earliest colonial expeditions from Paros to Thasos. Okay. In the dappled dusk, outskirting the city, I trudge the dustlands, thirst my guide, Sirius, whose scorching bite blights tree bark, strikes swift, sharp as the iridescent scabbard of a snake, stirs black bile that slaps the sides of my kettle belly, abrim with an inner barking. I cannot slake this want. It is as if I have drooled this silver crucible before me, pool of my riddling shape, in which I make out a liquid fox, its wet grin, red eyes with the slanted pupils of a cat. The other thing to say about Lycambes, the speaker, is that the name Lycambes means wolf gate or wolf walker, and there are lots of kind of references to wolves within this collection. Okay. A father overlooks. This is his perennial task, and he asks of the passage of light its business. For if it marks what it touches, his task is to mask this. He has no jurisdiction over the length of days or their consumption by shadow. Still, he overlooks, would angle his branches just so. You know, there are compositions of shield you'll not find on any battlefield. And this next piece is very much to do with the curse that's eating away at Lycambes. Said things tread close behind me. Said things in flight as speargrass barbs all paths and clings to all my loved things. Said things catch that tightening patch of skin thrumming back of the drumming ear. Said things pry, seek out gaps, dog the tracks that route trade to the mutest parts of a man's acts. Said things seep neath all his doings. Said things build his ruins in struts of straw, stack tinder for the flammable whispers of neighbours, party leaders, lawgivers, hang them all. Mix the matrix of said things to a squall. I am at sea. There is seasoning, stink under the song, held thick and fast as a gust at day's middle, or an unnecessary breath trapped in the unexpanding chest of a god. Once, approaching Thassos, night had barely sprung its trap, when side-saddled Selene spilled her silver over Poseidon's tray, as a slave boy sang of home from our prow. The touch of his sounds circled fields, surrounded tracks, inclined, steep mountain passes, verses feeling, sparse grass and rock underfoot, lyre netting all, till it slipped, his voice's grip left his frame, leaving its promise, a labyrinth of holes tunneling his bones. His shape trembled, snapping like a sail. Zeus. So, the lizard leaves its eyelid behind a film. The cat puts back its claws. The fox turns back into its tracks. Thus, I retract my vote. Leave it here on the perimeter of the agora, marketplace in ancient Greek culture. Fox, you have regaled us. Your fables of salt and overturned tables fumble at my outlines. I am neither eagle nor wolf. Am spined like a hedgehog on Paros, under Sirius. We like Lycambids, oath deep, buried quarry. Just waiting for a train to go past. I've got, hopefully you're not hearing it. I am. Okay. Each net, its holes. Each city, its walls. Each body, its exits. Each polis, poikilos, founding turbulence, changeling, skin covering snake and octopus, secreting night in which to hide. Scheme in beast speak, poet of fox fur. Though your costume is muzzle red, you'll not dine on my eaglets. Altar food belongs to the gods. And a final piece. Play dead, fox of self-cancelling step. Play rock, octopus, you see not of all groping limbs. There are things cunning cannot trap. Though your words prick the furrows of my back to a field of waving speargrass. Stay. See this wolf, poet, turn hedgehog, and know my trick picks your locks. Okay, thank you everybody. So that concludes the reading side of the event. So I think we're going to get everybody else, the other writers, back into the room, and I think what we're going to do is engage with some of the responses that we've had. So I'm just scrolling up and down the list that Sandra has excerpted from, and I think there are some, not always some questions, but there are some threads for us to think about. One of which, I'm just going through them in order, one of which is about memory. So one of the listeners was very interested in the issue of memory, and says that the idea of exploring how our memory is shaped and in turn shapes us via writing is really fascinating. So I don't know if any of us want to respond to that question about memory, really a question about memory and identity. And I know it's something that Z and I have certainly spoken a lot about over the years, and certainly something that we've factored into our writing identity creative writing module, where we think very much about the role that memory has in terms of shaping our sense of self, and also kind of pointing out how narrative memory can be, in terms of, memory is not just based upon personal experience. Memory is often narratives that are told to us that we then ingest and become something that helps shape our sense of self. But I'll throw that out to the team.
Well, I was very struck some years back. I was researching how memory works when I was doing some research for a novel I was writing. And I was really struck by it is all about narrative. It's about forming neural pathways and then repeating and consolidating those pathways by telling yourself stories over and over of the things that you remember, and the kind of family stories that get passed on as well. And it really cemented this thought that the great narrative that we're all involved in is the narrative of ourselves. The self is a construction, it is a story that we build, and then that becomes part of a social story as well. So I think that sense of being involved in narrative, everybody, in the way that they construct their identity and interact with people around them from quite early on.
I found that memory is very much central to the novel I'm writing now. As you've seen, there are the sort of strangely mixed memories of the protagonist and the crow and the things it's experienced. And there's, I found myself thinking about this piece of folklore, the two ravens of Odin, who are thought and mind, or sometimes that's translated as thought and memory. And so what is the difference between memory and mind? And it's I don't have any answers for you, but it's just to note that that's been very much part of the process of writing this novel. And as someone who, myself, as a dyslexic, I have a kind of strangely patchy memory. It's my working memory is very much less, has much less capacity than most people. And so I have a peculiar relationship with it, and it interlocks with my sense of my identity and my sense of not quite being in step with everyone around me, feeling out of step with the world. So it's a big theme of my writing at the moment.
Mm.
I just obviously I completely agree with what's been said. I think just what quickly became clear to me when I was starting my project is you have these kind of stories that you kind of think is the truth, and then
that's really
you quickly
interesting. Yeah.
And then you start talk to family members and people remember from different points of view, and you quickly realize actually maybe that story isn't quite what I envisioned. But then it becomes a question about whose story is actually the truthful one. And when I at the very early stages of the PhD, I really worried about this concept of truth, but actually all of them is truth, just from a different point of view.
Yeah, that's such a key thing with memoir, isn't it? Because you feel like you're kind of involved with other people's stories as well. Yeah. Delicate ground.
With regards to memory, I think.
Yes, Sabrina.
You go, Sabrina.
With regards to memory, I think what's really interesting is the authenticity of memory and how our collective memories kind of change what we do believe. So I worked on a different project, not this one, called I Remember Leicester. We put a publication out in June 2019. And it really was a collective memoir of the over 55s and and we didn't label anyone's memories. We just kind of put them all in together. And that in itself became a collective memoir of Leicester over the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s as well. It was really, really interesting project to be involved in and to look at how memories are forged when you chat to somebody else who might remember things in a slightly different way than you do and how it affirms or reaffirms what you believe.
And aren't we involved in a conversation at the moment about how our national memory works, and do we remember slavery, and is it part of our narrative, and is it part of our identity as a former empire and all of that?
Yeah, hugely important. We write our histories based on memory, especially about things that perhaps Britain isn't completely 110% okay with now, but they were back then.
Really interesting. I'm going to move forward slightly because I want to engage with all of the threads that have been plucked for me. The next one's very related, actually, so we should be able to move seamlessly into it. And it's a question that we've been asked, really, I guess, about our sense of identity as writers. So somebody has said, I'd like all the participants to consider the strengths they find as writers from being an outsider or from feeling part of the dominant culture, or from any combination of the two, which is actually a really interesting question. And I know my sense as a writer has always been a sense of awkwardness to some degree. I would, if I was with fellow academics, I'd justify my sense of alienation by saying, I'm a writer, really. When I'm with other writers, I would justify my sense of alienation by saying, oh, you know what, I'm academic or whatever. So I'm not sure it ever goes away, and I think in some sense that it's the root of a practice, isn't it? Because we said at the beginning, didn't we, that the importance of using writing as a way of thinking the world differently. Well, I guess feeling a bit different is your vantage point for doing that, isn't it? I think it is a really interesting question. I mean, on an anecdotal point, I just want to say just how wonderful it's been being part of the community of writers and friends within Leicester Centre for Creative Writing, and just how much personally I've taken from that. But anyway, I'll throw that out to the team.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating, isn't it? I think that it seems to me like all writers live and work with imposter syndrome. That's just absolutely part of the territory that we're in, because we're always out on a limb doing something new. On the thing about being an outsider, I mean, I came from a working class Irish family, a migrant family. And I don't have that in the forefront of my mind as I approach my writing, but it always surfaces in unexpected ways. I think, a lot of my writing has got a concern with migration, a love of narrative journeys, and also reading past places and times through a different frame. So when I wrote a book about polar explorers, Edwardian explorers at the turn of the century, I was really kind of interrogating what were they really doing there? What was the point of that great adventure? And the same really with this space collection, where I'm looking at how did the human adventure of spaceflight turn out to be so dark? A story that's rooted in gulags and concentration camps, and very gendered as well. It's a really male world, despite the hidden figures of NASA's story. So yeah, I think I always come at it with a slightly different frame, but I'm really interested in exploring otherness, kind of other people's experiences from another time and another place. So it just comes up in that way, I guess.
Yeah, so but saying that, I think most of my writing in one form or another is about outsiderness, and is about this experience of being out of step with the world, whether that's by nature of race or gender presentation, or social class, or indeed neurodiversity. And it's just across all my writing, it's the central thing. I think that probably this is a feeling that most people experience. We have this idea of the normal, which we are all aware that we're different from. But I think there are some people who are so far from that perceived normality that that it just becomes impossible to emulate this kind of ideal. And I think that for those people, there's a huge amount of stress associated with it, and that's, and I think a lot of those people turn to arts and writing in order to understand that and to express that. And certainly that's how I would regard myself. It's the outsiderness is both the theme of most of my writing, but also the drive is a drive to explore, to understand what the nature of other people is, and what the nature of the world around us is, and how I might fit into it or not.
That's really interesting. I've just scrolling down the list, and somebody had asked in response to the excited statement I made about the expansion of the kind of creative writing team, and so that I might say something about that. So yeah, so there are 8 of us within the team currently. So as well as those of us on screen, there's Nikki Valentine, who writes both genre fiction, horror fiction, crime fiction, and literary fiction, and publishes both as Nicola Valentine and Nicola Monaghan. We have Maria Taylor, poet, and we have Anthony Joseph, novelist, poet, and musician. Got a great band, and it's just got AHRC funding for a tour, as I understand it, who joined us this academic year. We have Josie Barnard, who's a novelist, published 5 novels, I think, and also an expert in what she calls multimodality. So the need for writers to be able to move across different platforms, and she's very interested in creative writing, teaching, and pedagogy. And Joe Dixon, who has just joined us, a poet. So very full and exciting team. As I said at the beginning, really, we certainly got plans for lots of other events, across the next academic year. Okay, so I'll just scroll down and if I can
I think
see
that
other.
mix of genres and practices is really generating a lovely kind of energy amongst the team at the moment as well. We're looking forward to doing lots of new things this coming year.
Okay, question for Rod. Do you imagine that the crow will be the primary narrator throughout the piece you read from?
Okay, I kind of slipped in an answer to that on the public comments thread. The crow is a minor narrator in it. It's Ellie. I don't think I could sustain an entire novel through that voice, but it's kind of one of the, you know, as writers we often talk about point of view and keeping in a single point of view. Well, it's interesting to think where you have a person whose mind is slipping into other people's minds or other creatures' minds. How do we handle that single viewpoint ideal? And so I chose that reading because it kind of plays trickily with that point of view thing.
Yes.
Okay, that's really helpful. And I've had a question. Again, kind of related to memory. Is memory always about words and stories, or can it be about the senses, the smell, the sensation of the ground underfoot? And well, I think the answer is yes, absolutely. There's a really compelling sensory memory, isn't there? And I think back to the beginnings of the 20th century. And think of Proust's big body of work where he kind of develops the idea of what he calls an involuntary memory. So memory that's exactly prompted by a sensory input. So in Remembrance of Things Past, very famously, it's soaking a bit of Madeleine cake in tea on a spoon and kind of eating it, which triggers a whole range of different things. And I think the interesting thing about involuntary memory is that it brings an entire world with it. It brings a context. So, I mean, we think quite a lot as writers about world building and the need to build a world for story to exist in and inhabit. But involuntary memory and that sense quality of memory always brings with it more than simply that event. There's a whole kind of range of textures, I think. So, yeah, in total agreement with whoever suggested that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I thought that maybe connected to Sabrina's thing about the authenticity of memory as well, because, for instance, I've got a really vivid memory, which is very sensory, of as a young child on Good Friday afternoon, kneeling outside in the garden to say the rosary with my family, and I can feel the gravel digging into my knees and I can feel the sun beating down. But actually my mother tells me this never ever happened. This is complete nonsense. And yet, you know, the story in my mind is so true because I can feel those sensory details, which I presumably borrowed from some other experience completely and kind of mashed together in this story. And I just wondered how that connected, Sabrina, with your question about the authenticity of memory, but also the way that you're kind of constructing false memories, aren't you, with your work at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, completely. That's what I'm doing. I'm creating something that never existed to sit alongside lots of accepted narratives. And fundamentally, going to the question about the outsider, it's the narrative of the outsider. We say that we write about what we know, we write about our experiences in whatever guise it kind of takes. I mean, as a mixed race woman who writes, I'm very much so the outsider. You know, I'm a mixed race woman who writes about rock music. These are layers of kind of white male worlds, really, that I kind of walk through and live in and then write about. So, you know, again, it's that idea of using the idea of the outsider almost like as a form of as a narrative device, really, to take these characters on a journey. I don't write generally characters who fit into a demographic. I don't write characters who are just white male characters, really. I tend to write a real plethora, a real crew of characters, and the conflicts that arise therein from them. So, you know, I find it's a comment on modern Britain, and it's a comment on the life that I've experienced, and a comment on the life I think that a lot of people in Britain do experience that's been completely marginalised. You know, I mean, it's that idea again that, you know, with race being completely whitewashed out of history, I'm creating something that sits alongside all those very white narratives. It disrupts that memory. I like doing that.
Yeah. So is that like a real counterblast to the sort of NME narrative? And
Absolutely. And the way things get remembered as well. I mean, Britpop, always remembered as being Blur, Oasis, you know, white male rock musician. Fundamentally, you know, Skunk Anansie played Glastonbury 1999, absolutely blew the stage away. No one remembers that though, do they? You know, things like that I think are quite interesting and have just been forgotten conveniently.
Yes. Yeah.
Something else that's come through on the thread is a question, I think for Siobhan and myself, but I think it actually extends beyond that really, because all of us are dealing with this degree, and it's about what attracts us to a given time period. So
right.
you're obviously thinking about the space race, Siobhan.
Well, I actually started off thinking I wanted to just write about space. I wanted to write about planets, you know, really right out there in space. And when I started to think about that, because one of my earlier books had been about the Northern Lights, and I got really interested in the relationship between the sun and the Earth's atmosphere and all of that. But then I thought, well, if I'm going to start to write about space, maybe I should start with the human thread within that, and how did we get up into space? And so that took me back to that moment of the space race. But I suppose that period has always had a bit of a fascination for me as well, because it's the time period of my parents' generation, which has always felt to me like another world, another planet in itself. And I've always wanted to kind of peek in and get a sense of how did that world work? How did that time work? So yeah, that sort of sucked me in. And once I got in there, I couldn't get out really. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
what about you?
I think that sense of once you get in and can't get out is very much the case with mine. I mean, I came across the fragments of Archilochus and was just really wowed by by just how rich they were, even though they only survive in fragments, and those fragments are still being discovered. I mean, one was discovered, I think, around 2013. Wrapped, papyrus wrapped around a mummy, and so it's just something really amazing about it. I think also for me, it was trying to track right back to the roots of ideas of lyric. Where we get the idea of lyric from, what does it mean? Because those are quite vexed notions, certainly within more experimental and avant-garde kind of poetry that's been an interest of mine for many years. That notions of lyric have always been kind of contested. So I wanted to take things right back to roots, and then I came across this legend attached to Archilochus, which is really, as I say, it's a legend that connects to ideas of poetic harm and poetic responsibility, and what it means to wield words with their respective powers. So and I really, Archilochus on the Moon, which is the first volume of the trilogy, that was supposed to be a 10-poem sequence in another book. And of course, here I am 10 years later, winding up the final volume. So three books of 80 poems in each book. So these things they run away with you, don't they?
Wow.
Absolutely.
So yeah, and Sabrina, you had a very strong sense of time and place that you really got drawn into as well with your work.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I'm not actually old enough to remember the kind of early 90s world, although I've got some of them. I was a kid back then, so for me it was a bit like I'd missed out on this and it sounded pretty cool. So yeah, for me it's a bit more like I wanted to be part of it, but that gives me huge scope as a writer to dramatize lots of stuff that didn't happen or did happen, or take a lot of source material from it, and to kind of engage with the voices that I think were contained therein as well. So I kind of come at it from quite an objective point of view. I can look at something from today's day and age and go, oh, that's really sexist, or that's really quite racist, or what that's written in those magazines, parody it. So really for me it becomes a parody of that time, although I love it. I'm kind of making fun of it as well,
So that's a little bit like me saying that's my parents' world and I want to kind of step into that and really peek at it.
Very similar. Yeah.
Yeah. Did Rod and Z, did you want to come in on that one at all?
Z, you've been quiet for a while.
I mean, because my work is quite place anchored. Well,
Yeah.
it almost becomes a sense of well, it's actually a work that sits between places, I'd say. And for me, memory becomes the bridge by which you build kind of a new world that takes in elements of those two worlds. So the question about is memory a sensory experience was quite interesting to me earlier, because it made me think about actually when I wrote the nude poem, the thing that drew me to that pond was actually a smell, but it wasn't a smell you'd find in the UK. I smelled something, it triggered a memory, and it drew me to the pond, and it kind of triggered this whole series of events on that actually got that poem into being. So, and for me, memory is very much a sensory thing, but it sits between places. It's not just one thing, because I have this kind of dual experience. So yeah, place is a complex thing for me.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Another
in terms of time periods, writing about, I suppose I'm very playful with that, and I mix up the different time periods. And as you saw from that reading, there was a bit of contemporary rooftop, and there was a bit of the Battle of Naseby. So it's and that's been the way I've worked through a lot of my recent work, is just being a bit playful with time and mixing things up.
And would you
You're a
say
bit of Lord.
just looking at another thing that's come through, a question about, or question to me about fragments. Are fragments particularly inspiring to contemporary and experimental writers, because there's something inviting about fragmentariness? And yeah, I think absolutely there is, absolutely something really compelling about the fragment, isn't there? There are lots of kind of heritage to the idea of the fragment that takes us right back to romanticism, particularly German romanticism has a big interest, doesn't it, in the fragment. But I think as a form, it's still very interesting and dominant to us, isn't it? I read relatively recently Lydia Davis, really interesting article on the fragment, and I know Sabrina and I've spoken quite a lot about fragments because her project is very kind of non-linear. So yeah, I think it's a really compelling aspect for writers.
Aren't both Sabrina and C disrupting linearity in their work?
Yeah, I mean, with mine, going back to the idea of fragments, we never actually see a full edition of Subculture. We just see pages from it, and we follow a narrative through the pages. And I quite like the idea of fragments because it always implies a whole. And I think as writers, we kind of do that, don't we? We say, for example, your work, Siobhan, you're looking at a fragment from these astronauts' lives, or with yours, Rod, you're looking at from this crow's perspective. And what we see in the fiction is just a fragment. It implies there's a whole going on behind the scenes, if you know what I mean. And that I think is really interesting. So for mine, I literally just present pages from this fake magazine, tell a story, but we don't ever see a full magazine. We never see a full copy of it. We never see a full year's worth of copies of them or anything. We just see bits. And the reader then has space to try and place together what they want to read into it. See, I think yours has got, it's non-linear, isn't it? Your memoir. You don't read it from beginning to end.
No, the whole kind of concept really was to allow that sense of fluidity of memory, so that when I'm responding to these words, it becomes a sort of catalyst by which you begin to excavate memory. But during that process, you don't then want to have the burden of chronology, because that's quite an artificial construct, really, when you think about memories. Memories don't come out in that way. So I wanted that kind of sense of freedom to be able to explore those non-linear routes. as you're kind of exploring with these memories. But as the work is evolving, themes begin to bubble up. And that's when we finally thought of actually this kind of alphabet structure to hold the thing together, because all writing needs shape, even if it is non-linear.
Can I just say, I love the alphabet idea. I think it's brilliant. I think it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yes.
Okay, everybody, absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure we could talk for hours. So I guess it's my job to make this now a fragment, and to bring it to this kind of conclusion. What I would like to say is thank you so much, audience out there, sending feedback and questions and just simply being there, because it's I know I've thoroughly enjoyed hearing everybody speak, but also that sense of people engaging, which is great. What I would like to say is that if you want to hear more about future creative writing events, if I give out the events office email address, then at least you can register some interest. So that email address is eventsoffice, all one word, lowercase, at dmu.ac.uk. And I'm sorry if we've not had a chance to engage with all of the threads that have come through the chat, but hopefully there'll be future events where we can continue these conversations. So thanks ever so much to my colleagues and friends for reading and talking, and thank you Sandra and the events office for putting all this together, but thank you most of all to everybody for tuning in, listening and asking questions. So take good care, everybody. Keep sane and keep safe. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.